Welcome to Atlas Podcast. On this week's episode, we're talking about the theory of evolution by natural selection. We're focusing mainly on the mechanism of natural selection. I think it's important that we understand it well enough to be able to really talk about it. I see a lot of times in conversations with people that they don't fully understand the mechanism of natural selection, and their argument ends up being towards something that really isn't relevant. So what we're doing today is focusing on exactly what evolution is telling us, or exactly what Darwin and neo-Darwinists have been telling us through that mechanism of natural selection. First, let's define what natural selection is. I have a definition here that I've written down. It's the process whereby organisms better adapted to their environment tend to survive and produce more offspring. And this is accepted as the main mechanism of evolution. Now, there have been tons of different theories for mechanisms involved in evolution that go with sexual selection and a lot of other takes on evolution. So natural selection is kind of a all-encompassing one, and it has to do with a lot of different things, and that's what we're going to try and straighten out today. Along with that, we're going to be touching on some basic kind of objections to natural selection and evolution. I want to kind of start the conversation about how this should affect our beliefs. What does this say about humans if natural selection is true? What does it say about us if natural selection is incorrect? I think those are very important conversations, and really is the core of the reluctance for people to really be open to even the discussion or the possibility that evolution is correct, that people are so ingrained to believe that they're set out and special from the rest of the organisms, because we do act a lot differently. But it's important to look at it and being as objective as possible and leave the controversy of evolution and natural selection behind and really focus on and engage the problem. And that's what we're doing today. So now that we've kind of defined it and laid out the framework for this episode, let's briefly cover some things that I think are very important to consider before we dive into the theory of evolution. The first is going to be that there's no mention of the origin of organisms in the entire origin of species. It's about really speciation or modification of species into new species, not really about the origin of life. The origin of life is a topic we'll cover in another podcast episode, but Darwin specifically does not mention the origin of organisms in his book. The next thing that I want to remind you guys of is that natural selection happens at the individual level, but evolution occurs at the population level. So populations of organisms evolve, not individuals, but individuals are subject to the laws of natural selection or the pressures of natural selection. And again, we'll straighten that out as we progress in this podcast episode. The next thing is there must be a struggle for existence for evolution to occur. We'll get into that as well. And then it's called, I want to answer the question, why is it called natural selection? I think this will become more apparent as we talk about it a little bit more, but it's really nature's influence on organisms. In nature, as in other organisms, the climate, their environments, like their actual structural environments, geography, where they're located on the earth. These are all things that naturally are occurring, and they naturally affect the organism. Another thing I want to briefly mention is the controversy behind Darwin's idea really on the human identity, and that's the biggest and the most threatening thing to humans from the perspective of naturalists or just the theory of evolution by itself, is that humans aren't as special as we think they are, and that's threatening to people. Obviously, people have an identity, have an idea of who they are and how unique they are as an animal, but they don't want to let go of that in the face of evolution. And that's why evolution has made such a huge splash in not only biology, but in religions, in theology, and in psychology, and just our human nature in general. I also want to mention a book called Darwin's Forgotten Defenders by David Livingstone, which talks about the early church and their involvement in the theory of evolution and their actual support of it. I think that sometimes in this world where we have guys like Richard Dawkins who are completely against religion, I mean, they're They won't even really consider it. And we have other people that are super priests, pastors that completely disregard the theory of evolution. You see this huge, just a false dichotomy. And in reality, it's not like that. There's people in the middle. There's people on this huge spectrum. And I want to make sure that you guys understand that as a possible explanation for the theory of evolution and how to reconcile that with our own identity. And now, not to say that there is no controversy and that theology doesn't butt heads with discoveries in biology, but from my perspective, it can get extremely blown out of proportions. And it's not a huge, only one can be right. You can fall somewhere in the middle. Although a lot of people believe one is right, it doesn't mean you have to fall in those categories. So now let's shift our discussion about how natural selection works. The first thing, and really there's 5 main points I want to cover, or 4 main points, and then we'll kind of wrap it up all together. The first one is there has to be a struggle for existence. There must be more organisms born that can survive. And really due to the fact that organisms want to naturally increase exponentially. So you have 1 horse, now you have 2, now you have 8. Pretty soon you have 1 million of them. And just the basic fact that organisms have the ability to do that makes interactions in nature unavoidable. And that's really what's behind the struggle for existence. More organisms die than survive. And just that basic fact alone opens the door for evolution. If you have, as we'll see, just a simple discrepancy between organisms, you start to have advantages and disadvantages. Another thing to consider is that this struggle for existence is really the strongest between organisms that are the most similar and inhabit the same type of environment. If you have 2 organisms that are consistently interacting with each other, obviously it makes sense that these are going to be struggling a little bit more for their own existence in reference to each other. They're going to be butting heads a little bit. And that, again, opens the door to evolution. So number 2 is going to be natural selection needs variation. Now, I hinted about this above, and obviously we have to ask this question: how do we get that variation? Well, variation happens naturally. There's variation between all animals, some more than others, and the real motivation for this variation is going to be through genetic mutation. The mutation part of natural selection is the only random part in this entire process. Natural selection by itself is not random. The mutation part is. And I'll explain this a little bit better. So when you have an organism, you have, right, it's genetic and it's DNA, and that DNA is represented in a specific characteristic. And I'll start with something very simple, which I'm sure you probably heard before. And we'll start with the rabbit. So you have a rabbit living in an area where most of the colors are green, brown. There's not a lot of snow. And the rabbit itself is brown or dark black or something like that. So it blends in with that environment. And that specific gene that it has is represented in that color, brown or black or kind of a dark color. Mutations come along and change that color in only very few organisms. And now just with rabbits in an environment, if you have enough of them, you're going to have that natural variation. But again, it's random. So you get maybe a white one, maybe a light gray one and stuff like that. Natural selection really hasn't occurred yet, but that door is now extremely open. So now let's say you have 100 rabbits and 90 of them are brown or black. 10 of them are white. The white ones are going to be picked out more in that brown, black environment, right? It's simple. It's very simple to think that it's very easy to see how the predators would be able to spot out the white rabbit more often than the brown one. But now, again, that's the genetic mutant. But let's say a winter storm comes by, or even a small ice age comes by, and now the environment, instead of being brown, has turned to white. Clearly and very instantly, there's a huge advantage for the white rabbit, and the white rabbit can blend in with its environment much better than the brown ones. And observations like this have been made with tons of different organisms. You see that population's gene pool shift from a majority of brown and black alleles, or brown and black genes being represented in their actual characteristics of the animal, to white. And that by itself is really an example of evolution. We'll say that it's instead an example of speciation or variation, and natural selection doesn't account for evolution in changing an animal between species. We're not really there yet. That will be for a future episode. We're really just trying to understand how evolutionary theory works. So number 3 is going to be that no organism is perfect for any particular environment. Natural selection doesn't demand perfection. All it demands really is variation. If you have variation, you can have natural selection and theoretically get to evolution. Now, natural selection is favoring organisms based on advantageous variation specific to the organism's current environment. As we saw with the rabbit example, the white rabbit wasn't picked in the environment that it didn't have an advantage in. Once it had that advantage in, then it was picked. And again, I'm saying picked, but really it's almost like a law that interacting animals, the one that has the most advantageous variation is going to be the one that's most successful. Next, I want to touch on number 4, and that's large populations. We talked about populations kind of in the introduction to this podcast episode, and how you need that allele and gene frequency changing in the population, not in the individual. An individual is not going to evolve into a new species. The population is. You can't have evolution on an individual level. Again, it's just like the definition of evolution has to be in the population. That's something a lot of people get confused. They're talking about, oh, well, how did a mouse turn into a bat or whatever? How did a fish turn into a human? Well, it wasn't the fish that turned into the human, like a singular fish. It was the population of fish that slowly over time changed different allele frequencies in their own gene pool to get to that point. Again, I'm getting ahead of myself. That's for a future episode. So for the 5th kind of point I want to make, it's going to be really all these points mixed together with a few new ones. So I call it the cycle of natural selection. This is not exactly what Darwin coins it, but he gives a good diagram of really how natural selection works. And I just came up with the name, the cycle of natural selection. And it starts with what I'd previously mentioned, a high number of individuals. If you have a high number of individuals in a massive area, you instantly develop pockets where certain individuals are more successful than others. And in those, not only do you need a huge population, you need a huge location. If you have an entire country to spread your animals across, you're going to have tons of different environments and tons of different opportunities for these organisms to evolve to better fit the environment that they're currently living in. And that principle really revolves around isolation. So in a massive environment, you have isolated populations. You have the population that is living on this mountain, but you also have the population that's living by a lake. And obviously, we can see how the individuals by the lake will have a different environment to get accustomed to adapt to. And that, in response, will make them different from the organisms living up on the hill or up on the mountain and in the valleys. Next is going to be modification. So how do you get modification from these organisms? And we spoke about it a little bit earlier, is selective pressures. In selective pressures, there are a ton of different ones, but I'm going to focus on a few, really 2 that are, I think, really big. So first is a novel environment. So this can include predation, new food sources, and new climates. And I'll explain each one individually. So let's say you have a huge population of organisms. You spread them out over a huge area. You get isolated pockets of organisms. And they're starting to get accustomed to new environments, and a part of that new environment is new predators. You now have new threats. There will be certain organisms that go to certain areas that maybe they are top of the food chain. They don't have anything to worry about in that environment, but there will be others that move in to an environment where there is a top predator and that they're at an extreme risk of being completely wiped out by that predator, and that's a huge selective pressure. If it's too strong, obviously it will result in extinction, but a selective pressure that is just right will enable that organism to adapt to that current environment. And it's similar to what we're talking about with the rabbits, but in this case, we can use the example of moths. So let's say, hypothetically, you have a whole bunch of white moths and a whole bunch of dark brown moths. If you put those white moths into a birch forest with white bark, they're going to have a much easier time really evolving that setting. But let's say you take those white moths instead, and again, you have a huge population of white moths. They're spread across the country. The ones in the birch forest are fine. You move into a dark oak forest, and now they stick out like a sore thumb. And they're going to have to really rely on the fact that some of the mutants are going to be brown and will be less likely to be eaten. And if the selective pressure, again, is just right, they'll have the ability to respond to that and evolve. The next one that I mentioned earlier is new food sources. So again, it's the same situation, huge population spread over a huge area. You're going to have different sources of food in different areas. We can keep with that moth example. And let's say that a moth in a certain environment, there's barely any food for that moth, or there's barely any flowers for that moth to get the nectar. But maybe in another area, there are a huge population of them. Well, obviously that population that's in that good area with high food is going to do better than the other population. And just at that simple level, that's a selective pressure that can motivate evolution. The next is going to be a new climate. Now, this was an example I heard very recently. I think it shows how just a new climate can really affect how organisms operate. So this one has to do with grizzly bears and polar bears. Polar bears, as we know, live further up north. They live in a colder environment. Grizzly bears live usually further south than polar bears. In certain areas, though, due to the fact that the climate has been changing, it's been getting warmer further down, grizzly bears are actually moving up into the location of where polar bears live. And as a result, we're actually getting hybrids between polar bears and grizzly bears. And I think that's a really good example of how climate can completely change like the geographical distribution of an animal, of an organism, forcing it to adapt. And since it has that large area, it can go up and actually meet the polar bears in its own area and start to create hybrids. That's almost an instant speciation kind of effect that just a climate simply can have. Sorry about that. I was just sitting here in my office and I see this bird come down with another bird in its claws. And I don't know, I just thought it was really cool and kind of weird that I'm talking about evolution and natural selection here. And I live in an area here that I can basically see it happening. The next thing I want to talk about, and again, another selective pressure, is going to be competition. If there's too many organisms in a location, it's going to have to be time to switch your tactics. So if you have a bunch of birds, let's say, feeding on dragonflies, for example. Well, as a bird, if you're really the only food source you have access to is those dragonflies, or then maybe that's your main food source because you live by a body of water, well, you're gonna have to start thinking or start adapting to be able to eat maybe seeds or something. If that dragonfly population gets completely decimated to where it can't rebound correctly, then you're going to have to adapt as a bird and figure out another way to get your food sources. And just as simple as that, as we know with Darwin's finches, you can completely change the physical structure of a bird based solely on its food again, which is a result of its competition. Another easy example of competition might be nesting sites. Just talking about those barn swallows. If you have a bunch of barn swallows here that are just nesting right under the barn right there, then eventually that area gets taken up, and now those barn swallows that come back the next year and maybe are looking for nesting sites need to move somewhere else. As a barn swallow, they like nesting on structures. I'm sure they can nest elsewhere. But again, this is an example of how maybe that behavioral change can lead to evolution, or really is an idea or is an example of natural selection. Next, I want to do just a little thought experiment. It's called The Drunkard's Walk by Stephen Jay Gould. And I only really recently heard about it within the last, 8 months or so of looking at all this stuff. One of my professors mentioned it, and I thought it was a really good way of helping somebody understand the mechanism of evolution. So it starts, this drunk man walks out of a bar, and he's now in between the wall and the ditch. Let's say it's 10 steps from the wall to the ditch. And he moves randomly back and forth. So he may take one step back, or one step forward, one step back. Once he hits the wall, he's stabilized, and now he really only has the option to move forward until he lands in the ditch. And the idea is that this simulation is run for an indefinite amount of time, and the conclusion 100% of the time is that he reaches the ditch. And I might be asking yourself, how does this represent evolution? And the idea is that if you just have the most minimal complex organism, and it can randomly change back and forth. Maybe some mutations are good, some are bad. It's not going to mutate to completely just eradicate the entire population. So it's mutating back and forth, back and forth. Given enough time, it will always reach that ditch. And that ditch might be just advanced life or be a new organism. And that's, I think, a good and easy way to think about evolution and how it can progress from very simple species to more complex. I want to quickly go over those 4 characteristics that we talked about so you guys can remember them and use them in conversations with people. The first is going to be the struggle for existence. There has to be more organisms born than can survive. Number 2 is natural selection needs variation, and this variation is given through mutation in different genes. 3 is no organism is perfect for any particular environment. There's always an organism better, and natural selection is not trying to perfect an organism, but just pick the most favorable variation. 4th is a large population. You need a large population because evolution doesn't occur at the individual level. It occurs at the population level. And 5th, we talked about the cycle of natural selection and talked about how you need a high number of individuals in isolation in large environments. And also you need modification through selective pressures like novel environments and competition. Lastly, we're going to talk about some objections to natural selection. And then I'm actually going to end just talking about Charles Darwin's The Origin of Species and what I thought about it and really who I'd recommend it to. I don't think I'd recommend it to everybody, but again, I'll get into that towards the end. So these are just some objections that Darwin addresses, and I think he has very good answers for it. The first one is going to be intermediate species. There are not very many transitional fossils, and that's just how it is. I mean, there are some for whales and horses. I think those are the best ones. I'd actually recommend going and checking out videos about that so you can assess the evidence for yourself. Again, we'll get into the evidence in a future video, but there's clearly a lack of intermediate species, and I think really the reason is not completely because the fossil record isn't not a perfect spectrum, but really the theory of evolution kind of accounts for that. And the fact that varieties linking two species usually existed in very small numbers, and they weren't advantageous, or else they weren't extremely advantageous, or else they would have propagated and become their own species, or replace the species that they're connecting to. Another idea is that maybe that species, that transitional species, was good for a certain environment. And once that environment changed, the species was forced to change again. And you don't really see the middle one. You see the two that it's connected by. And they made like quite a bit different. And you're asking yourself, how did we get there? Well, it's because we're missing a piece. Another thing, I never really knew how inaccurate, or really not necessarily inaccurate, but incomplete the fossil record is. There, I think, estimated like 30 billion different species that have lived on Earth. And these are eukaryotic species, not prokaryotes. So we're talking like larger kind of organisms here. 30 billion species. That is a ton. And how many we have is about 250,000, which is nothing compared to 30 billion. There are massive gaps in the fossil record. And not only that, but I'm not sure if it's 95%, somewhere around 95%, 90% of those fossils are marine animals. So we don't have very many animals that represent, or fossils that represent, transitional species on Earth due to the fact that they just weren't preserved. We have gaps in the fossil record. That's a fact. And I think you have to ask yourself, if we had those 30 billion different species and we had a fossil for every one, would we see a perfect transition, or would there still be gaps? It's something, again, you have to ask yourself and kind of discern with your own perspective on it. But I think it's unlikely that if we had access to 30 billion different fossils, that it wouldn't be a good smooth spectrum. And maybe it would. Maybe there'd just be tons of variation. The same problem would arise. But it's something just to keep in mind, that the fossil record is very, very imperfect and very, very incomplete. Another big objection is just the creation of DNA. And we'll talk about this when we talk about the origin of life. Proteins and DNA need each other to work together. They need each other at the same time. So you can't have functional DNA without functional proteins, but you can't have functional proteins without creating them from DNA using other proteins. It's a conundrum that's been very heavily researched, and it's been around for a long time. Again, we'll dive into that in a future podcast episode. Before we end this podcast, I want to briefly mention, like I said, my thoughts on Charles Darwin's Origin of Species and who I'd recommend it to. Number one is this copy that I have. I have the Barnes & Noble Classics edition, which I've never been like really big into collecting specific types of books or picking the paperback over the hardcover, but this is by far the best edition I've seen of the Origin of Species. I find that a lot of them are either really expensive, they're super small with like 800 pages, but the pages are 3 inches tall. I don't know why. That seems to be like the mass paperback version. And from what I've seen, this is the best copy. Again, if you're on the audio version of this podcast, it's Barnes & Noble Classics, The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. So with that being said, let me get into really my review of the book. The first thing I was surprised about how intelligent Darwin is. Darwin spent so many years of his life really formulating his thoughts and opinions about the theory of evolution. I think the fact that some people look at Darwin and like, oh, he didn't even know DNA existed. What could he be talking about that has any importance? I think that's really just a bad attitude of looking at it. Darwin's book is fantastic, really, for understanding how science should be represented. He represents his theory, but he also goes into various objections. He doesn't admit to know it all. He doesn't say in the book that I'm 100% certain God doesn't exist and evolution is true. He really stays out of that conversation and is just mainly focusing on his theory and in his developments in developmental biology. I think just from that alone, it's something that you can appreciate from the book, even if you don't get anything else out of it. Another thing that I really enjoyed was the case studies. He knows a lot about organisms from all over the world, and he talked to a lot of people about these organisms. And he had tons of different case studies and tons of examples about how evolution can work. And those examples really helped me understand what exactly he was talking about. Of course, not everything about this book was perfect. The geological portions of the book were very slow for me. I'm a biology major, and I've done a lot of research about biology, natural selection, evolution, genetics, DNA, all that kinds of stuff. So the biology portion of this really resonated with me, but I flat out just don't know much about geography and about different geological principles that he had mentioned in this book. And unfortunately, they kind of went over my head or forced me to have to write certain things down and review them later. So if you're into not only the biological portion of natural selection and evolution, but also the geological portion of it, I would absolutely highly recommend this book. Again, it's dense. It'll be a slow read, and I really think it's better for somebody with a prior knowledge of evolution. Prior to picking up this book, I probably read thousands of pages about evolution and natural selection and different views on that. And even at the time I was reading this book just a few months ago, I was in an ecology class, where we talked about some of the exact same things that Darwin mentioned. It really helped me solidify what I was learning and understand it from multiple perspectives, and really in I don't want to say plain English, but in just simpler terms, in terms that I can understand a little bit better. I also had resources like my professors and other peers to ask about certain questions in our class, or just questions about the origin of species. So with that being said, I think it's good to have up-to-date resources available for better understanding. Some of the information here is actually obsolete, and he was incorrect, which isn't surprising that he wrote this a long time ago. But again, it's important to understand that not everything he says is golden true. So now I want to answer the question, who exactly would I recommend this to? I'd recommend it to somebody, like I had mentioned previously, with prior knowledge about evolution, or at least with resources that they can go to. There are other books like The Greatest Show on Earth by Richard Dawkins that actually present evolution very simply and gets you started about the theory. Now, The Greatest Show on Earth has a ton of information in there, and by no means is a bad book compared to The Origin of Species. But again, if you already have that basic knowledge of evolution, you've taken classes on it, read books about it, this would be a good option to go to. I think it's extremely important for anybody really in the realm of discussing evolution that they pick up this book and read through it. It's like, you can't, I don't want to say you can't critique evolution. You haven't read this book, but once you've read it, you start to see just the basic misunderstanding of evolutionary theory and of natural selection, of The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. And again, that's a huge advantage in conversations with people, and just a huge advantage for understanding how we came to be as we are. So again, have resources available. Maybe pick up another book and read this alongside it, and ask questions. Make sure you're looking up things and asking questions and looking at up-to-date resources. I hope you guys do check out this book and take my advice on this copy too, because this is a nice copy. So thanks again. I really appreciate you joining me on Atlas Podcast, and I'll see you next week.